Welcome everyone. In this presentation, we will assess the global renewable energy market opportunity and what it means for investors and operators across the value chain. We will look at where the money is flowing, which technologies are accelerating, and how regional dynamics are shifting. The goal is to translate market signals into clear strategic actions. Let's start with the big picture. The headline is strong momentum, but with growing complexity underneath. In 2025, the renewable energy market reached about $1.74 trillion, and total clean energy investment hit a record $2.3 trillion. At the same time, policy headwinds in major markets are already reshaping expectations, including a 5% downward revision in the IEA outlook. Renewables are still on track to overtake coal as the largest electricity source by mid-2026, with solar continuing to lead. So the opportunity is large, but navigating it requires sharper regional and technology choices. Now let's zoom in on the growth trajectory. The market is projected to expand at roughly 17% per year, rising from $1.74 trillion in 2025 to about $7.28 trillion by 2034. That kind of growth is being driven by 5 reinforcing forces: cheaper solar, supportive policy frameworks, and rising corporate procurement. Add to that major progress in storage costs and continued grid investment, and you have the foundation for higher renewable penetration. The key message is that demand is not coming from one place, it is coming from economics, regulation, and corporate buyers all at once. When we break capacity additions down by technology, solar clearly dominates. In 2025, solar represents about 77% of new renewable capacity, around 520 gigawatts, and it has scaled more than 5 times since 2019. Wind is still meaningful, but growth has slowed, largely due to permitting friction and supply chain constraints. Offshore wind remains a smaller share in the near term, but it stays strategically important where policy support and grid access are strong. Overall, the system is increasingly solar-led, which has major implications for storage and grid planning. Investment levels reinforce that same story of scale and transition. In 2025, total clean energy investment reached about $2.3 trillion, roughly double fossil fuel investment. Electrified transport is the single largest segment, but renewables and grid infrastructure remain central, with about $690 billion into renewables and about $483 billion into grids. One nuance to watch is that renewables-specific investment was down year over year, influenced by regulatory shifts in China, even as overall deployment finance stayed resilient. So capital is there, but it is rotating across segments and geographies. Regionally, the center of gravity is starting to shift. China is still the largest market at roughly $800 billion, but it posted a decline and is facing more regulatory uncertainty, even while installing over 400 gigawatts annually. The European Union stands out as the growth leader, up 18% to about $455 billion. Supported by programs like RE-Power EU and a strong offshore wind pipeline. The United States is growing modestly, but the outlook is mixed due to policy rollbacks and a significant forecast cut, despite renewables representing the vast majority of new capacity additions through late 2025. Meanwhile, India and the Middle East and Africa show strong growth rates and are becoming important adjacency plays. Next, let's translate that into a practical technology opportunity view. Solar and battery storage sit in the star category, combining large market size with high growth, and that is where aggressive investment tends to be rewarded. Onshore wind and large hydropower look more like scale leaders, proven and sizable, but with lower growth, so the focus is usually on optimizing and harvesting returns. Offshore wind, green hydrogen, and geothermal are the higher potential bets, attractive but with more execution and policy risk, so positioning matters as much as timing. And for smaller or declining niches like biomass, small hydro, and tidal, participation tends to be selective and case by case. Even with record momentum, several risks can materially change outcomes. In the United States, policy reversal risk is high, with tax credit phase-out pressures and permitting impacts contributing to an IEA forecast reduction of about 50% across many technologies. In China, the first funding decline since 2013 and new market rules introduce uncertainty, even though the long-term scale remains enormous. Grid bottlenecks are a medium risk globally, because even with about $483 billion invested, interconnection queues can exceed 5 years in the US, which directly delays projects. Add supply chain margin pressure and higher interest rates, and you get a market where execution discipline becomes just as important as technology selection. Bringing it all together, 3 strategic priorities stand out. First, double down on solar plus storage, because solar is driving most new capacity and integrated projects can deliver the strongest risk-adjusted returns, especially in higher growth markets like the EU, India, and the Middle East. Second, diversify geographic exposure to reduce concentration risk in China and the US, and to rebalance toward more stable growth environments, with Europe as a core anchor and emerging regions as targeted expansions. Third, build a grid and infrastructure position, because grid capacity is becoming the binding constraint, and segments like high-voltage direct current, smart grids, and grid-scale storage remain underserved. If renewables are moving beyond 40% penetration, the winners will be those who invest not only in generation, but in the systems that make generation usable.